Welcome to our Coaches Kitchen Table Discussion Series, where you join myself and the top coaches and influencers in the sport community, where we talk about a variety of topics related to coaching, athlete development, and so on. In this episode, we talk with special guest Kerry MacDonald. Kerry is a U Sport National Champion coach for UBC and presently the Director of Sports Science, Sports Medicine, and Innovation at Volleyball Canada. In part one of our two-part series, Kerry discusses Volleyball Canada's development of its gold medal pathway and the importance of standardized testing both at the club level and with our national team programs.
University of Victoria, then I went back to Calgary and did my PhD, finishing in 2016 before going to UBC. So that's kind of my coaching / volleyball involvement. I've been in and out of both. I worked for Volleyball Alberta and I've worked for Volleyball Canada a number of times in a bunch of different roles and capacities. But most recently, has been 2 years now that I've been in this role as Director of Sports Science, Sport Medicine, and Innovation for Volleyball Canada. And so in this role, my primary job is working with the national teams, specifically around the IST side, so the integrated support teams. So everything from sports psychology to strength and conditioning to athletic therapy, all of those pieces, and just building the team around the team for our national team programs, as well as trying to implement different sports science or innovative concepts within Volleyball Canada. So whether that's through our pipeline within our national team, or whether that's dealing with concussion management within our youth programs or whatever. So I got a really diverse portfolio, which is what I like and I love. And I like to think I have the best job in the country, and pretty happy with where I'm at. So yeah, so that's maybe a little bit of background about me and what I'm now doing. And then an update on kind of our national teams or what's going on with COVID in Canada. Obviously, everyone's been dramatically impacted by it. With our national teams, all of our athletes or most of our national team athletes were playing professionally overseas at the time of this. So our initial step was get them home and get them safe. After that, it was get them training. So we've switched from being a program that delivers everything in person to delivering online and virtual. And so similar to what a lot of the provinces are now doing with their provincial team programs, we started doing with our national team program just a little bit earlier. And we've been doing that now for 3.5 months, delivering our national team program and supporting them virtually, with the exception or with the continuation of that, I should say, as of today, we have our men's national team back in training for the first time in the summer. So they started up today, and we have a 3-week training block going on in Gatineau before our athletes are actually returning back to playing pro earlier this year. So the FIVB calendar is being shifted by a month, so they'll end a month earlier, which will be great next April, assuming some normalcy happens, and we'll continue on with Volleyball Nations League. But yeah, so we just got a little bit of training block in now, which is great because we're happy to ideally get a return to training and monitor the return to training of our national team athletes before they head back overseas. So hopefully get them a little bit healthier before they head overseas. So that's where the men are at. The women just started in the weight room today in Richmond. Different provincial guidelines and regulations allow different things to happen. So we were able to do more training in Quebec than we are in BC, but we're in the weight room with some of the women's national team that are local, and we're looking at having some sort of a modified training program or on-court options for those athletes that are local. But again, the women are, for the most part, heading overseas, and beach is also up and running. We have our training center open for those those teams that are choosing to join the training center. They're open in Toronto indoors, and then some are not being part of that, and they're doing their own thing either down at the beach in Toronto at Ashbridges Bay, or some of them are down in the States because there's some AVP events starting up. So that's a bit of an update on us. Lots of things moving around.
What's I know there's a couple coaches with the Ontario provincial teams here, but what's it been like online training? What's been surprisingly positive out of it, and what's been frustratingly difficult out of it?
It's a really good question. Surprisingly positive. I think our compliance has been incredible with the national team. So compliance to, like, we usually do daily check-in stuff. Now we're doing weekly check-ins with our athletes, but then they have like a workout program that's on their phone. It's an app-based software that we use. And so they're using that, and compliance is just fantastic. So They record all their weights and reps and sets, and how much we can accomplish without ever being face to face from like strength and conditioning perspective, for example, is incredible. So I think that's one that I would say is definitely been a success. I think frustrations is being probably just trying to schedule different meetings. You know, we're used to just having the athletes in our training center. And it's like, oh, we're going to have a nutritionist come in and give a talk. Now we have to figure out, okay, what's everyone's schedules, and does that work with everyone's schedules? And as much as you would think everyone's sitting around with nothing to do, a lot of people got really busy, and even our athletes were really busy giving talks like this and webinars and podcasts and starting up their own side jobs or doing some schooling online and taking classes online. So our athletes were actually quite busy, and the scheduling aspect of it started to become a challenge for us. But those would be a couple.
Yeah, that's cool. All right, so we asked Kerry to come in and talk science volleyball with us. What I want to do is I sent out the 3 topics we wanted to sort of focus on. And what I'd like to do is provide you guys the opportunity to ask questions. So if you guys type your questions in the chat box as we go along, and we finish each of the main topics, what we'll do is we'll go back and address the questions. We'll just get you to turn on your mic and come on and ask the question to Kerry. And then we'll go from there. And if it leads us down another discussion, we can go for that. Kerry's sort of given us a length of time. Last time we went for 2 hours, so that's Vicky's got the record so far. So we'll see if Kerry can beat that, because we just want to have discussion. So feel free to type in your questions, and we'll get to you when we can, and between each section. So the first one I wanted to talk about is sort of rehash what we sort of talked about with Vicky, with the LTAD 3.0. The new things that we saw in it, or what I saw in it, was the gold medal pathway and the athlete development matrix. And when you and I, Kerry, talked before that you've sort of been more involved with the gold medal profile than you have been with the athlete development matrix. Can you give us sort of a sense of, in general, with Volleyball Canada, what they're doing with this information, how they're approaching implementing it, and where do we stand right now in terms of implementation of these things?
Yeah, good question. I think the first thing, to be brutally honest, is that for us at Volleyball Canada, it's all relatively new for us as well. So the development of these pieces and these resources and tools is not something that's been historical within Volleyball Canada. A lot of the sports that have been doing this a lot longer are those that tend to be more the engine-driven sports, where you can assess an athlete's progress by looking at a stopwatch. Whereas in our sport, it's really, really tough to measure development of athletes, and are they getting better, and what really matters. And it's a very complex piece. So yeah, so 2 years ago, I embarked on creating the first and foremost piece that was actually driven, that Own the Podium really wanted us to have completed, was our gold medal profile. So as I mentioned, that is where I've spent the vast majority of my time, and it's an ongoing process. And it just, the more time you spend on it, the more complex it seems to get. And yet we're constantly trying to bring it back to something that is relevant to our staff and to our coaches. So maybe, should I share my screen, Colin? Does that make sense? So I can kind of give you the sample. Yep. I'll show the sample of what we're doing. Okay, let's do that here. So hopefully there now you're seeing my my screen. I'll make it a little bigger, but I'll zoom in a bit. Okay, so this is the summary, and it's just an Excel spreadsheet, and we're actually moving this away from this Excel format into a far more complex thing using a software suite called R. It's a computer programming statistical analysis software, and it's going to it pulls data from a bunch of different data sources and updates this on a frequent basis for us. So the main thing I'll take your attention to is this is broken into 4 main areas. So our gold medal profile has a psychological component, physiological component, a psychological component, a technical component, and then what we call like a daily training environment, or plus, or this is where also like kind of the life skills and kind of the soft skills start to try to be evaluated. So I'll kind of just break down each one a little bit. So if we go into our physiological tab, so each one, that's the summary tab, that's all being pulled from this one. So if we go into our physiological, this is our physical testing side. So here you're going to see there's a few key metrics that we're looking at. So we have spike reach, block reach. We have an agility test that we created, and I can go through all these as well. I think everyone knows spike and block reach, but we have a modified pro agility, which is a 3 meter, 6 meter, 3 meter, just to simulate the actual distances we cover in our sport. And then two others that we have on here is our attack velocity and our serve velocity. And these are two different metrics, assessments that we created as well at Volleyball Canada on how we assess these. From there, once we plug all of these numbers in, there's a bunch of different ways in which we score them. So for things like spike and block reach, we can actually get those numbers from other countries as well. So this is the one piece that FIVB requires every country to report. So what we do is we compare our spike touch on our block touch to the best in the world. And then based on where our athletes are at compared to the best in the world, we have a scoring system that is allocated based on that. If we don't have best in the world, if we just have our Canadian data, which is for all of our custom assessments, then we have a different scoring system that just looks within our Canadian data. So yeah, so that's kind of our physiological. The other thing I'll just say is that it's changing rapidly. We are just in the process of purchasing some new force plates. And so now we're starting to use force plate analysis a lot more, not so much from the assessment from a total performance piece, but more to look at both return to train from injury, as well as to customize a lot of our strength and conditioning programming for each individual athletes based on things like force velocity profiling, determining whether athletes are force deficient or velocity or power deficient, and then customizing programming from there. So we have a lot more coming on the force plate side, but we're still trying to figure out exactly how we're going to put that into this as well. So we're more playing around in this area. Any questions on that? Do you want me to keep going here, Colin? I'll keep kind of flying through the different tabs.
Nobody's typed anything in. Anybody want to click on the yes button and ask a question? No, I just say find it fascinating that we're moving more and more technology, putting it involved in our science part, right? I mean, the force plates are, I know working with FitQuest here and Capital Strength, that force plates are being used a lot more. So even for the club coaches that have clubs or have conditioning programs, I'm willing to bet the force plate will come in and be a lot more accurate for athletes. So it's kind of interesting we're getting into that. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I could riff off on talks about force plates for most of this talk, but I'll save everyone the bore on that. So the psychological, this is another area, and
Here.
this was there a question? Sorry.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Interesting, you're using just a 1 rep max for your spike and block touch. Have you done anything with, you know, at the 30 rep mark or anything like that? Like anything that gives you a better reflection of performance over a match?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we don't use it for our testing purposes, but with the we use the vert devices in match. And so we monitor that a fair amount to look at fatigue throughout match. We actually have our own custom piece of software that matches our data volley files with our vert jump files. So we're able to tell the exact jump height of every single attack, whether it's a kill or an error. And then we can also look at jump performance of, say, just attacks over the course of a match. So we use it. We do have a fatigue kind of an assessment piece that we do on the back end, but it's not a component of our gold medal profile. But it's a really good question. It's a really good point. We did, and I'll just to not bore anyone too much, but one thing that we have found a little bit is that for the most part, our athletes don't fatigue in jump height. What they fatigue in is their rate of force development. So we did a small study when I was still coaching at UBC, where we played a set of volleyball, or sorry, we had 12 athletes complete some force plate jumps, counter movement jumps. We played a set of volleyball and then we did the jumps again. Played a set of volleyball, did the jumps again. And we played 4 sets of volleyball and did the jumps before and after every single set. And what we found was that none of the athletes really dropped off, or there was no significant drop off in their counter movement jump ability. So they could all still jump to the same height as pre-match. However, the rate, so how quickly they could get off the ground, was slowed down. So it's almost more of a reaction time piece that we see fatigue, not so much a maximal force production, and at least at our level. So we've seen the same thing with our vert data. When we look within a 5-set match, Stephen Maher is still jumping just as high in the 5th set when he's hitting a left side ball as he is in the 1st set. The highest ones almost all still come in hitting warm up, if anyone's wondering. That's usually everyone's PB happens still in hitting warm up, but I actually think it has more to do with optimal environments and the crowd watching and everything else, and they're really thinking about it. Everyone's PBs are in hitting warm up, and then after that, if you just take first set versus fifth set, almost everybody jumps the same height, but we know the fatigue's going to affect their rate, how quickly they can get to that max height, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so that sort of leads to the athlete's ability to deal with that type of fatigue, right? Because they're obviously able to handle that fatigue and then overcompensate that with other energy systems, or even mental energy or mental capacity to still maximize their jump. So that means they're able to change their timing, their approach timing, to get to the same height at the same time when they need to, if in theory the set is at the same location all the time.
Yeah, so there's minor modifications in their biomechanical approach or jumping mechanics that they'll change slightly. So there may be a little bit deeper flexion or whatever that happens to be, but at the end of the day, they'll end up getting to the same height, which is good for us to know. When vert first came out, this was everything that everybody thought was, we just got to use this as a fatigue metric. And it was relatively early on that I noticed back in Calgary that the athletes didn't seem to be jumping any less in the fifth set than the first set. And I was kind of really surprised by it. So we did some more stuff and kind of realized we have a little bit of a glimpse into maybe why that is.
Just explain what verts are, just in case there's people that are not aware of those things.
Yeah, sorry. So they're an inertial measurement unit. They're about the size of a USB thumb drive. You wear them in an elastic band around the waist, and they use a Bluetooth sensor to connect to a phone or an iPad. And they are just made to measure jumps. So they give you a jump count, and they tell you the jump height of every jump that you take. They also give you some landing impact data as well, which we're just in the process of validating that. That'll be published here soon. Are going through the validation of that as well. So yeah, that's for a company out of Florida. The sensors are available in Canada, and yeah, it's a neat little tool.
So
Have
Kerry,
those costs come down? Sorry, have those costs come down at all?
I want to say they're $150 per unit, maybe something like that, maybe 200.
So it's still about the same.
Yeah, I'll be honest, we have a partnership agreement with them, with Volleyball Canada, so I haven't bought a unit in a while, so I'm not the best person to ask. Yeah, so yeah, I think that's the pricing, but I know Volleyball Stuff is the Canadian distributor, so if you check out volleyballstuff.ca, that's where you can get them through there, and they do have team rates and packages and stuff like that as well. So
is there any effort to slow down the set or raise the set later on to counter the data you're finding?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that. The reality is that the change in the rate of force production, we're talking like 0.2 of a second. Like it's pretty minimal in the how much time it would take. Where you would notice it actually more, where people would actually be impacted, would be how much you would expect your middle blockers to say be able to be in a full read and react. That's where you're probably going to see the impact in our sport, more so like with fatigue, as well as your defender's ability to make digs. You're probably not going to make as many, rapid and incredible digs as with the onset of fatigue. So that's my initial sense anyways on it. I don't think it would really change our attack height much, but it definitely could. You're not going to be quite as explosive, but it's going to be more of those quick reaction things that are going to be impacted in a greater fashion.
Okay. Now that you're talking about quick reaction and fatigue, what about arm speed and blocking?
Arm speed of the attacker, you mean?
No, of the blocker. So we talk about there's different people talk about blocking in terms of where you position your hand, because your hands can move your fastest. You can keep them low down, and then other people say you need to keep your hands at shoulder height so you can get them up quickly, short distances, because that's all reaction time. So if you're the science guy, is there any science so that will help me say, okay, which one is better, or am I going to go based on the athlete individual reaction time skills, or where are we heading with that one?
You're trying to kill me by opening up the debate on hand position and blocking here, Colin.
Yeah, well, you're the one that taught me that, so I had to get you back on this one.
Yeah, it's I think it's a very situational piece. I think for the most, if I was using generalities, and I don't like speaking in generalities, but in generality, I would say most blockers start with their hands too high. It's not the limiting factor in them getting over the net. But that's a very general concept. There's situations in which higher hands are going to be required, but there's a lot depending. Like if your jump requires a lot of knee flexion, your hands are not your slow part. If you're able to block with minimal knee flexion, like that joint takes a long time for us to, bend our knees to jump is a fairly slow process. So if that's the case, your hands aren't your time limiting factor is what I would say. However, if you're going to be quick and reactionary and you're not really bending at the knee joint or bending at the waist too much, and you're kind of just popping off your ankles, higher hands are probably start to become a limiting factor in your speed. But yeah, we could also have a very long conversation on hand positioning and blocking, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's got to be age dependent too, right? Or size dependent, developmental stage dependent. I mean,
yeah.
When you're 6'8", there's a difference in a 5'3", 14-year-old versus a 6'8", 25-year-old as well, I would assume.
Yeah, and I think just the only other thing is we're going to move faster laterally with more neutral hands than high hands. So if that's a key component of your blocking systems, then that would change the technique that you would maybe want to employ if lateral movement is a real requirement. Right. We don't move laterally, and we don't move really well in any direction with our hands above our shoulders.
Right.
So, yeah,
makes sense. Okay.
Okay, awesome.
Right.
I'll try and go a little bit faster through some of these other pieces, and I'll say that these are all somewhat works in progress. So this was started in 2018, and we've kind of evolved it from here. The next one is a psychological assessment piece, and at the time we did a series of 3 different psychological tests. We actually had over 60 questions that were assessed of every single athlete. The athletes did a self-reflection. We also had a peer assessment, so another peer member assessed them, and then we had the coaches assess them. And it was on a bunch of different psychological skills. From those tests, they were broken down into a couple different variables. So we had a foundational psychological skills, a psychosomatic, a cognitive, and a mindfulness score. So our intent with this was to kind of have like a baseline level, go through a summer of training with our sports psychologist, and then have kind of an exit level and determine where athletes are at, and start to understand, does this correlate really well with performance as well and our better performers? So that's one way in which we tried doing it. Another one that we've done, and I would say we have stopped doing this truthfully because it's really, really time consuming. It's over 60 questions per individual. So you can imagine if you're the coach and you have to do every member of your team and answer these 60 questions, it's a really time consuming process. So we've dialed this back. We're actually doing something completely different right now because of COVID. We have a different psychological thing that we're doing that's unique just for this year. And we've also done some stuff looking at statistical analysis for psychological skills. So we did something what we called a red zone analysis, where we looked at athletes' performance in red zones versus athletes' performance in non-red zone environments. So red zone was situations where it was close score, late in match. And then we used our data volley data to assess how athletes perform different skills in that component of the match versus early in the match or when there was large leads in either direction. So we've done that as well and taken a look at that. And that's been an interesting one that we're kind of looking at a little bit more at the moment. And we use that one a little bit. And we will be using that in our gold medal profile that we submit this fall. Yeah, so that's kind of the psychological. One thing I'll just mention to this group is we're really hoping to have a psychological assessment component or process that we can share with our provincial bodies as well as they can share with their clubs to try and get assessment of like a self-assessment check-in piece around psychological skills and start to understand where athletes are maybe feel that they are weaker, and then what are some resources that we can do to try and address those areas and provide them some resources. So this is on our radar, something that we really want to try and help our club and provincial teams with moving down the road. But it's a really complicated one. One thing I'll just say is we've looked at other NSOs, so other national teams, to determine how they're doing this. And this is probably the one area, or maybe not, yeah, this is one of the key areas that most national teams really struggle with doing well, is how to psychologically assess their athletes. So it's a continual work in progress, and this is what we had at the time, and we're continuing to adapt it from here. All right. Next up, it's almost embarrassing to show this now because it's gotten so much higher from here. and we've gone so much further and deeper. And a lot of the work of Lionel, who's our head scout with the men's national team, has done a lot of work in this space. But this is what we were doing at the time. So this is our technical skills. This is based off of our data volley data from the game matches that we play within a season. We would filter through key matches, often only looking at matches against, say, top 12 teams in the world. And then we pull a bunch of different stats. So in here, you're going to see things like serving. This is for setters. The stats that we were looking at was serving, fast sets, high ball sets, middle sets, blocking, and then they get an overall score. And then we do that. And then we have, for left sides, it obviously varies a little bit more. It doesn't have the setting as much, but it has the receive. And we can kind of go skill by position and break this down. Yeah, and then our coefficient is actually ranking the coefficient value is just it's a statistical calculation based on a bunch of different statistics within that skill set. Often it relates most closely to what is like the proportion of points earned, is kind of how it's based. And then the way we rank it in this one right now is just showing it's actually ranked against just each other, but now we've thrown that out the window, and now we're actually ranking all of our stats against everyone else in the world. So when we assess the serving of our setter, we're assessing it first all the setters in the world, and how do our setters stack up. So this is the one that's probably the most looked at by our coaching staff, the one that they really hang their hat on, and one that probably makes a lot more of the impact on our pipeline athletes and our next gen athletes, on which ones are trending and tracking towards senior team, or junior team athletes that are definitely tracking towards senior B team or next gen team. So this is one that's really key there. And unfortunately, the final the version that we now use, I can't show you quite yet, but we're pretty close to being able to display some of it. But it's also some stuff that's proprietary that we don't want other nations to see, and how we're doing that as well. So that's some of the statistical side of it as well.
Just a couple things on that. Brenda has a question about why not separation of back row attack. And for me is how do we use it, or can we as club coaches start using this type of concept in order to help our athletes see that big window, that big picture of where they want to go? So in other words, will you guys be doing it with the junior team, the B team, the junior team, then the youth team, select team, so the national team, all the different categories have the stats that our club, as I can go to my left side and say, hey, look, this is what you're looking to do and you need to work towards in order to be at the top level.
Yeah, we have that already, and it's a continual work in progress. But we have, under our gold medal standards now, we have our physical testing standards at every level, and I can pull that up here as well. Let me just 1 sec. I just realized I didn't open that document, so let me just grab it here quickly.
And don't forget to answer Brenda's question.
Yes. So the question, on the back row, we definitely are incorporating that now. So now, I mean, we go a lot deeper. We have back row based on which rotation they're in. We have based on which middles in the front row, whether it's your M1 or your M2. So it gets very, very detailed. Let me just change my shared screen here quickly. So I gotta stop sharing. I'm gonna share a different screen now, just for the gold medal.
You have standards. Like 150 staff members taking all these stats and breaking all this down for you, or? I mean, no, it sounds like a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. We have Lionel kind of leads this side of it as our head scout. So Lionel leads for sure all the collection as well as kind of the synthesizing of this. And then he works with a couple of different individuals. He's done a lot of work with Nate Go, who's the head scout for Team USA, as well as the head scout for Australia. Ben Raymond is another guy that's done a lot of work with him, and then he's got a couple of Canadian scouts that he works with on this, and it's kind of just for them, it's a lot of like side project hobby stuff. But with Australia and USA, it's a lot of resource sharing. The scout world, I've come to realize, is a fairly close-knit group around the world. They all share their own scout files, and a lot of them share their approaches on how they're doing things, and so. Okay, so here's just something quickly. This is something we developed a couple of years ago now, and we're just continually updating it. So there's two real tabs here. Hopefully you can see this okay. So the first tab is, this is our physiological. So this is all the testing data. So if you take our senior team, senior A team, A and B team, sorry, and we look at our setters, what we have here is spike reach, the average, the best out of all the setters, and what the minimum was that made that team. We then have the junior national team, and we have the youth team in the same capacity. So this is as our core testing pieces, and this will be updated again whenever we do another round of testing with our national team on intake. So this document's been shared with all the provinces, so every PSO has access to this, or I'm happy to share it. I've sent it to Colin so he can share it out as well. And then on the technical side, we tried to create a very similar piece. So what we did is we went through and we took, although we don't often use these stats, these are stats because these are stats that most clubs would be able to capture. So what we've broken down is, what is the ace percentage of a senior A athlete, right? What is the junior athlete? What is the youth? So what's ace percentage, air percentage? What's their point score percentage on float serves, on spin serves? Here's receptions. And then we have attacking in the same kind of regard as either an opposite, an outside, or a middle. And then we have blocks and digs. So it gives some standards of what's happening at the national team. The challenge here, however, is if you look at it, there's some funny things. It's like, well, how come our reception just gets worse the more you go up the national team? You go from the junior team to the B team to the senior team, and your passing just keeps getting worse. And obviously the serving just gets better. So taking things at the highest level and trying to apply them down doesn't always work that well, but we at least tried to apply them to give some goals. And so athletes start to have some understandings of if you're not able to pass this well at your university level, you might have a hard time making a jump to being on the senior B team as a left side or something like that. So at least it's information that's out there. So same idea. We'll keep updating this document. And then we are also working right now and doing a similar thing with club volleyball. So trying to look at we got a bunch of data this year from OVA, for example, and looking at some club standards to do the same thing. And then we are running the same thing from Canada Cup for provincial teams as well. So that provincial teams could start to get an assessment of within the Canada Cup data, this is what we're finding. So the standards approach is something that we're hoping to be able to expand upon and just continually update on an annual basis and publish these results.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's it goes back to that psychological training of allowing that, or that Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour book there, where it's you show that window of what could be, and that motivates that athlete to get there. And if we can show them these numbers, and we're constantly showing our athletes these numbers, those that are motivated will take them and run with them, right? And if they don't have them, then they don't know. They think they're working hard enough, right? They think they're passing well enough. But if we can show them these things, that'd be awesome. So I think that's for Volleyball Canada to do that for us will be a big benefit for the coaches out there and the athletes in terms of, and I think for Volleyball Canada in general, because you'll see better athletes or more athletes coming out with better percentages and skills coming out of it just because they're motivated.
Yeah, and our goal was to try and have kind of especially those that are having that national team aspiration, having them playing at a level where this type of data is being collected on a regular basis. So it allows for us to run standards reports like this, and it allows for athletes to be getting assessments. So we're trying to find cost-effective ways to bring that. A big bonus, honestly, last year was even just having volleymetrics being more widely used across youth sport was a huge bonus for us. Before that, at the national team level, we really had no stats going into a national team camp. We had no stats to go off of. We were just relying on what the coaches said was a good athlete, and then we have a 3-day tryout and we have to try and assess who's actually good. And so this year going into national team tryouts, we were way more prepared than we had ever been, and then we didn't get to have them, but we had stats like we'd never had before. And now I think less athletes are potentially going to slip through, and we're going to make better and more informed decisions because we have a season's worth or multiple years worth of data as opposed to just a 1 or 2 or 3 day tryout. So that's the goal.
Yeah, so it sounds like we're, for the gold medal pathway, we're pretty secure, or Volleyball Canada is pretty secure with the technical, the tactical, and the physiological components. And yep. It's the mental side, the psychological component that's really the test. And yep. But I mean, and that's next week's discussion is with with Kyle. So, I mean, we're bringing in the right guy to help us talk about that and see what we need to do as coaches to help our athletes, but also what he thinks Volleyball Canada or other national sport organizations need to do for that side of it. So that'll be interesting. So it's a good leadway for us, and we can pretend we're hit home and expect a whole bunch of good answers from them, but we'll realize that it's a work in progress for sure.
Yeah, and the last thing on our gold medal profile, which I didn't show, is it was titled initially as daily training environment, but it's trying to get at those athletes' soft skills. And for a lot of what we were looking at was, nutrition. Would our nutritionists say that they're someone that, eats healthy? Sleep. We know sleep's really, really important. What is the sleep hygiene of the athletes, and how do we assess that? And we have some sleep questionnaires that you can ask for those components. And one of the big ones for success at our level, at the national team level, is what level of professional league are they able to play in? And to be honest with you, that's one of the greater predictors right now of future national team success. If you're heading over to Europe and you're going to play in Italy, Div 1, fresh out of university, you got a pretty good chance that you're going to make some waves and impact on the senior national team. Whereas if you're going over to play in, Div 2 Germany, straight out of university, that's an athlete that's a lot further away probably. And the market kind of tells us that, the pro clubs will pay for talent and skill. So an assessment of future potential is those pro contracts. It's not everything, but it's something to be considered. And then the other piece is athletes that play in higher levels get better faster than those that are playing in lower levels when they do get over to Europe, right? So that's another just a component that we have in our kind of other assessment pieces that we know impacts development. So those are some, and then I think there's just some life skills. Those athletes that are able to manage the daily stressors of life and balance the schedules and make everything work. Those are athletes that often can have success at the high level. Not necessary, but it's definitely more of a nice thing to have.
Yeah, I think, one, obviously you need a good agent by the sounds of it. If you want to make national team, you need a good agent to get you up there in get a good pro contract. And secondly, I think as club coaches, what we can do on the other end of that is we can teach those soft skills. Like we can really have athletes understand how to live a healthy, constructive life where you're able to deal with deal with mistakes, deal with adversity. By teaching them growth mindset, teaching them perseverance, and we can do that through our practices. We can give them those opportunities to develop those skills. Because just being an educator at the elementary level, you see the amount of kids that don't have those soft skills, not just in sport, but just in life in general, and how they have a hard time dealing with adversity. A lot of them, we see it coming out right now with just COVID, and that big change of life for them has created people that can handle it and ones that can't. And we're going to see in September, I think when we go back to school, how that's impacted those that have been able to deal with it. And I think education is an important part. They're all skills that can be learned, right? And that's the thing is we have to teach them the skills and we have to give them opportunities to learn the skills. And I think as a club coach, we can do that. We have great opportunity, great access to the athletes, and we have their attention because they're doing something they love to do. So to give them that opportunity to look at and say, hey, I can become a better player if I learn how to do this. So it's a selling point, I think, as well. And I think if we continue down that path and Volleyball Canada continues to talk about the soft skills, and the LTAD talks about that and has put it out there in that matrix, I think we'll start to see even more and more potential athletes for our national team, but I also think we'll see a lot healthier general population coming out of volleyball because of it. So thanks for that information on the gold medal profile. Just give anybody an opportunity to ask any questions, sort of what Kerry's talked about there going forward. Questions on how do you think it could relate to your club, your individual athletes, or even questions about, well, how does it work with the national team athletes? If you have questions on that, feel free to I think you guys all have access to the yes and no's. So you just click on yes and we can, call you up to turn on your mic if you want. And I'll give that 7 seconds for those introverts to process their questions and click on the yes. And then if not, no questions, we can move on. And again, if you have questions later on, we can come back to them as well. Yeah. All right. I think that's long enough for introverts and extroverts to process. So, all right. So moving on to the next big topic, which was assessment and evaluation. You sort of talked about through it, but maybe just give us your general philosophy on the importance of using assessment and evaluation in, let's say, tryouts, and then ongoing throughout the season. What things do you think are important to be assessing and evaluating to help the athlete develop?
It's a good question. I think one of the key pieces for me is I think a repeated measure design is always going to be better than a snapshot. So for the most part, most programs will only ever do testing at tryouts. So whatever testing they're going to do it once a year. And I can tell you that we were in a very similar boat with the national team when I started as well. And in a lot of situations, to be truthful, we were lucky if we even did it at tryouts. It was like, why do we need Gavin Schmidt to do spike touch? He just might injure himself. Let's just not do spike touch. So we didn't have 5 years of data of Gavin Schmidt doing spike touch. I apologize, my kids are in the background, but yeah, so that was what we were doing. And then what's happened is we've now progressed more to a situation where we're doing a more repeated assessment. So when I was at UBC, we did spike testing every single week. And it was just kind of part of our weekly assessment piece. So no matter what you're testing, if you want to understand how it's changing over time, you need to do it more than once. And if it's something that you want to change, and whether that's a skill or skill improvement, or whether that's a physical testing assessment, in either situation, you just need to assess it multiple times. So I think this is something that we're not very good at in sport. And I would rather have a very simple test that we can do on a repeated basis that we can have some belief in, rather than a whole battery of assessments that we only ever do once. So that's kind of where my head's at a little bit, just from a testing perspective. So repeat the design and repeat it as frequently as you think you'd expect to see change. And so if there's certain things that you know are going to take a long time to improve, then expect that and don't assess it on a real frequent basis. And I see this a lot. Here's a classic coaching pitfall, is that we work on something in practice for all week, and then we go into a tournament and we don't see that it got any better, and we assume that we didn't get any better at it. But it's in the same regard as we worked on it for a couple of days, and then we expect immediate transfer into a game environment. We expected it to get better right away. And we need to assess that change over time. So again, stats, if we're taking stats at every single game we play and at every single tournament, that's great. If we're taking stats in an inter-squad in a practice environment, that's even better. That's just more of a repeated design. And that environment, actually, we can control the strength of the opponent a lot better. And it can be a really good way of determining whether or not we're improving with what we're working on in our practice environment. So that's maybe a long-winded answer, but I think that's philosophically, that's where I stand on it. And I would say that I think there's a lot that we can be doing in our daily environment that is assessment, as opposed to just thinking of it as a separate NHL combine that we do once a year.
Yeah. So when you say assessment, so if let's say it's serve receive, and we're focusing on footwork, or let's say arm platform. Like you said, we practice for 2 days, we go into the tournament. How do we assess if we see improvement? What would be important for the coach to take a look at or do to make sure they're seeing improvement versus just the stats? Because the stats probably aren't going to change that much, or they really shouldn't. So how could they assess it, or how would they evaluate improvement?
That's a good question. One of the key things that you'll see, we can assess one of two things. There's outcome and there's process, right? So most of the time when we're looking at stats, we're taking a stat of the outcome. Almost every single time we're statting the outcome, and we're not statting the process. So if we want to get into a situation where we're assessing process, that's really more of that subjective assessment, and I mean, I'm going way back. I remember Keith Hansen once saying that one of his key factors is he wanted his middles to not go the wrong direction. That was how he always started every single year, was middle blockers just don't go the wrong way, don't make the wrong read. So he would just start off with just how many times did they at least go in the right direction. He didn't care if they were on time. They could be an hour late, but as long as they were going the right way. And he would have a checkbox, and at the end of every match, he'd give a top middle award, and the top middle was what percentage of time did they just go in the right direction. the setter set left, setter, and it didn't care if they got the stuff block or not. That's all so he was trying to stat the process is what he was trying to do. So I think there's situations, especially in youth athletes, when we're trying to make large technical changes, ones that in particular will not improve the outcome as you're talking about, and they won't show up in the stats line. I think that's where we want to start looking at how can we assess the process and improve the process. And it's probably not going to be as clean of a statistic. It might be something more that you do on a napkin than in a spreadsheet, but that can be something that can still be a valuable process to go through to show progress. But I think at the end of the day, if you're making that change, eventually it should improve the stat. If it doesn't improve the outcome, then you shouldn't be doing it. So at the end of the day, you also want to have that. And so I wouldn't don't throw the outcome out. We just maybe don't want to assess it as frequently when we're in that learning process, because you're right. Everyone, this I forget the law, but anyways, with change in any parameter, initially we're going to have a drop in performance before we have an increase. So once we change it, it's not going to be as pretty initially, but hopefully it's getting better over the long term.
Yeah, I mean, I've with that concept, I sort of use that with serve receive in practice, especially with the younger, is using, not necessarily perfect, but using another athlete to assess the contact in terms of look fors. I'm looking, let's say if we're looking for that forearm platform, that athlete is evaluating their peer and saying, did I see that platform move whichever, forward, or was it a solid platform on contact? And there's a checkbox for them, and they just look for that process. And the result means nothing. Did you get those check marks for the amount of times your platform was there? So it's sort of giving that both athletes an opportunity, because just visually checking it will help that athlete recognize it for themselves when they go into it. And then of course we can now with iPads, we can do self-evaluation or self-assessment as well. Did you see your platform change? And in your iPad, all they see is the actual themselves. They don't see where the ball goes. Helps them out with that side of that concept too. And I think that makes a huge difference for that athlete if they start to understand. And that goes to that growth mindset as well, right? That soft skills they can learn. Don't worry about the result. Can I forget about the result and just worry about my technique that I've been focused on? So there's where we can incorporate our soft skills as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. All right, so that's assessment evaluation. Does anybody have any questions on that? We sort of went over it quickly, but it was sort of the idea that we process and outcome are different things and used at different times. Outcome is sort of that's where am I at with my skill in terms of the result, that external motivation, wherein process is trying to accomplish or change something in my skill to get better at it. And it takes time to do that.
Yeah, maybe one thing I'll just mention on the assessment piece with the physical parameters. So if we just need to be really cautious of developmental age versus chronological age. And that we're quite often going to see that early maturing athlete have better physiological performance numbers than that later maturing athlete. So, and that's just something we just need to be somewhat aware of. It's a tough piece to really try and lock that down, but just keeping that in mind, we do see, and we're doing a bigger assessment of that right now. It's one of the projects I'm working on, is a relative age effect in our sport. So what that means is those athletes that are born in the first half of the year versus the latter half of the year are then more likely to be selected to certain teams. So we're doing I'm doing a historical assessment in the last 10 years of national team rosters right now. And right now it's turning up that it's there. We are definitely selecting more athletes are making the national team that are born between January and June than July and December. And it's still ongoing. We're looking just in women right now. We still have to do the men, but it's something that we just really need to be aware of, that we aren't just selecting the early maturing athletes. There's a really good podcast a webinar like this that USA Soccer just recently put out, talking about how massive the relative age effect is in minor soccer in the US. Like, it's a pandemic down there, and they really need to do something. And they are doing something about it. They're changing all of their age classes, and to try and address the issue that they're having down there. They're actually going to the point of, in certain regions, they're selecting regional teams based on, this team is only January to June, this team is only July to December. And so you're going to run 2 18U provincial teams, and they're broken by age month as well. So anyways, just something to be aware of. Yeah, so that's just, and then the other piece that I'll just mention as a bit of an aside is that what we find is that the setters and liberos, for the most part, their technical skills are pretty strong predictors of their overall performance and future success in our sport. So those that are technically putting up some good stats numbers, in their junior national team, youth national team levels, are usually the ones that'll hold a lot better as they go through. Whereas on the other positions, the middles and opposites and left sides, their physiologic, like their spike touch numbers are actually fairly predictive, I would say more predictive, or mean more. So the physiological side of it is really more important for certain positions in our sport, whereas the skill and technical side is more important in others.
I forgot, I want to mention this, tryouts, using physical testing in tryouts. You see across the clubs, they do the exact same physical testing for every single athlete. So your 18U athletes doing the same physical testing as a 13U athlete, which in my mind, again, there's some problems with that, but I think more on the side of the technical skill side becomes a bigger issue. For me, I don't need to know if a 13U can pass a ball. I need to know if they're athletic, right? I mean, my perception is if I'm a coach and I have an athlete, I should be able to teach them how to form pass a ball. Versus if I have someone that can form pass a ball, but they can't run, their speed or their quickness is so slow that they never get to a ball anyways. Do we have to be careful of that when we start using these types of same testing through the whole age group?
Well, especially at the youth level, if we're using any sort of physiological assessment, we're basically just picking the early maturing athlete. That's where it's even more of an issue when they're still in their developmental ages. Those that are more developed are going to perform better than those that are less developed. So it's a real challenge, I would say, at those youth levels. And the value of physical testing at that age to me is pretty minimal. If we're talking 13, 14U, I don't see a huge value, to be honest, because I think a lot of it can change. And I think it's a real challenge. Trying to predict athleticism in a 13, 14-year-old is a really, really tough thing to do. And predicting how much someone can improve is not something that we can assess in a tryout environment. Those are things that takes months to understand, how well an athlete learns and how quickly they can adapt and change motor patterns. So I think it's a really tricky environment to get into. And the same thing, if we assess just form passing skills, the kid that just did a 1 week prep camp is going to look a lot better than the athlete that has never played volleyball before. And we're going to pick the kid that did a 1 week prep camp time and time again. So we need to be aware of that, that those are all factors. And in an ideal world, we're able to look at progress over time and see how an athlete improves and develops over time and make a selection based on that. But I don't envy anyone in select. I hate doing selection camps, and I just don't think there's a great way of doing it. I think we just have to accept the fact that we're going to be probably wrong more than we're right.
Yeah, and I guess the bigger the cohort you can take, the better chance you have of capturing the late bloomers, right? So as a club, which is tough, and again, especially with in Ontario, our season is a challenge because we're starting meaningful competitions within a month of tryouts. So you have to be careful, but it would be a great opportunity if we could select 30 kids, 40 kids, or keep as many kids as you can and let them train for 2 to 3 months, get to know who they are, get to see them, who's coachable, who has the athletic components, and give them a chance to develop the skills and then sort them at that point. Ultimately sorting versus cutting would be the best way to go with all clubs. But that's not realistic in terms of coach availability, facility availability. But I think more and more clubs are trying to do things like that. I think which is a good thing in the end, is to provide as many kids opportunities. And I think that concept of not getting as many as you can in will help out, and doing sorting versus cutting, I think, is a way to go in the future for sure. This is the end of part 1. Thanks for watching. Click in the top left-hand corner for part 2. Be sure to subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed it.